Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Well, I took a couple of days off, Saturday, Sunday, and I am back. Needed a break. Believe it or not, I do have a full-time job in addition to making content. So, as I sit here today, we are continuing our analysis of the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. We're also having a look at what is happening here in the United States and, at the same time, the battlefield, Promised Land, the ongoing war between Israel and Hamas. Now, there is a serious issue inside of Ukraine, inside of the borderlands. Ukraine means borderlands, so it is appropriate to say the borderlands. End of discussion. Now, what is happening is multifaceted in terms of the Ukrainian state, the borderland state. There is a fissure, a divide right now between the Ukrainian military and the Ukrainian political leadership in Kiev. The military leadership, especially the head of the Ukrainian military, Zaluzhny, believes the war is at a stalemate. Zaluzhny does not believe, under the current circumstances, he has the ability to conduct successful offensive operations against the Russians. This has upset the president of Ukraine, Zelensky. Zelensky is beholden to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, specifically the EU, and the Biden White House. Look, whether you like it or not, Zelensky has thrown his lot in with the Social Democrats here in the United States. It's just a fact. It is just a fact. Now, the Social Democrats here in the United States want to continue this conflict, want to continue this war. They believe Russia is a threat, possibly, to their one-party unitary state that they wish to enact upon the United States, the ending of the Republic. Now, the Biden White House, along with political leaderships in the EU, believed that a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive was possible, that they would break through Russian lines, the Russian defenses would collapse, and the Ukrainians would drive all the way to the Sea of Azov. Now, the reason the Social Democrats in power here in the United States believe that, because of a chameleon-like chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley. General Milley is this new generation of American general. He is a chameleon. He transforms himself into whatever the body politic is at the time in the United States. And right now, he's trying to say everything he can to please his handlers in the White House. Meaning, in all probability, he went along with the idea that the Ukrainians had the capability to break through Russian lines, especially in the Zaporizhzhia offensive. And the Ukrainian state, even though the information coming from Ukrainian generals, especially battalion commanders, was that this was going to be a costly effort that most likely would fail. But they went ahead and prosecuted the offensive. The offensive failed. Now, the Biden White House, the EU, is in a utter uproar. They have spent vast amounts of treasure, military equipment being provided to the Ukrainians. Real-time intelligence is essentially non-stop for the Ukrainians. But again, all that was for naught because it failed. It didn't work. And Zaluzhny is trying to tell the political leadership in Kiev the war is a stalemate. Now, do the Russians believe the war is a stalemate? Probably not. The Russians are looking at 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years into the future in terms of what they are doing. Enhancing and expanding their military-industrial complex, expanding and enhancing their military, enlarging it. And then 3, and most important, we're starting to see the Russians change doctrine, which was needed in the Russian military. In order for the Russian military to be successful on the modern battlefield. Now, this battlefield in Ukraine is changing war as we know it. It really is. Because of technology, because of the ability for rapid data infusion, fusion, and then the ability to strike targets quite literally within minutes of obtaining said data or information about the enemy on the battlefield. Both sides have this capability. The Ukrainians wouldn't have it if the United States didn't give it to them, and the Russians inherently have it. They probably have less capability in terms of real-time intelligence than the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians are getting direct feeds from the United States. And the United States, in terms of technology, in terms of that data fusion, in terms of that capability to sense what is happening on the battlefield, is much more capable. Well, I don't want to say much more, is more capable than the Russian military at this point in time. But the Russians have more equipment, they have more manpower, and again, they're adapting and changing to this war as well, to where they are eventually probably going to meet or exceed U.S. real-time intelligence in the theater of operations, meaning in Ukraine. Other parts of the world, that's a bit of a different story. But in Russia's backyard, or rather front yard, the Russians inherently will have equal or possibly greater in the future situational awareness in terms of what's happening on the battlefield. It's just going to happen. Now, again, Zaluzhny, head of the Ukrainian armed forces, is saying what he's saying, and that is irritating Zelensky greatly, to where it's possible that Zelensky may be thinking about getting rid of his military commanders and all those who are supporters of Zaluzhny. So it is a serious situation that's happening. Now, the problem is for Zelensky is the Ukrainian military is very much behind Zaluzhny, so he may not have that political capital to spend in terms of getting rid of Zaluzhny. I would say at this point he does not. I would say at this point Zaluzhny is probably more popular in Ukraine than Zelensky is. Food for thought there. Another key metric that is not reported, and that is the status of the Ukrainian armed forces. The average age of a Ukrainian military service member is now over 40 years of age. That is an absolute fact. The average Ukrainian ground force service member is now over 40 years old. Why is that? Well, the Ukrainian military has sustained catastrophic casualties. A lot of Ukrainians, fighting age males that were between 18 and 26, all the way up to the early 30s, have fled Ukraine for Western Europe. To include a much ballyhooed and popular content provider, Denis Davidov. Okay? 400,000, 500,000 Americans watched this knucklehead, and he was smuggled out of Ukraine to avoid Ukrainian military service. So as Americans volunteer to go over and fight for the Ukrainians, Western European nation states have volunteers heading to Ukraine to fight for the Ukrainians. You have this Davidov who's making content about Ukraine, about the Ukrainian war, who was smuggled out to avoid military service. And he is definitely under the age of 40 and has the ability to serve his nation. He's chosen not to. I'm going to get too much on that, but that's a case in point of what's happening. We know the Russian average military fighting age is far younger than 40 years old. The Russians are not having that issue in that regard. Are there older Russians volunteering to serve? Yes, there are. But not like what we're seeing in Ukraine in terms of a very aged military population. There was even a Ukrainian who arrived in Germany, I believe it was Grafenwehr, to train with his combat unit in Germany. There are training sites all over Western Europe and the United States training Ukrainians now. It's very difficult for the Ukrainians to train in Ukraine because of Russian ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. One of the Ukrainians that arrived at Grafenwehr was 71 years old. There was a Ukrainian private or sergeant that arrived in Oklahoma to train on a U.S. military base. That Ukrainian was over 60 years old. It is not uncommon to now see 50-year-old Ukrainian frontline combat troops. But again, average age 40 years old. That's a serious issue. And you won't hear that in the mainstream media. It's not being talked about at all. You won't hear about it. This is probably the first time you've heard about it. And that's unfortunate. And that's why channels like these are very important. Now, the fighting continues. The fighting continues near Avdiivka. We believe the Russians have actually broken through the north by northwestern sector of this area. This area here, you have the coke factory. No, Zelensky, that is not a cocaine factory. It is a coke factory, as in metallurgy. I am Batman. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Others have no idea, nor want to know. But again, Russian breakthrough in the north and the encirclement operation of Avdiivka continues. The Russians continue counterattacks not just north of Avdiivka, but now we are hearing the Russians are attacking in the south near Volhodar and other areas where the Ukrainians had originally launched the Zaporizhzhia offensive, the failed Zaporizhzhia offensive. And these operations continue. The fighting continues. I would say at this point, as opposed to large-scale maneuver operations, we are seeing an uptick in the use of Russian fixed-wing strike aircraft against Ukrainian targets. We're seeing a lot more use of the Russian version of the JDAM, GLONASS guided bombs, dumb bombs that have been converted with glide mechanisms to give them a certain standoff element. Look, are they of the quality that you would see with a U.S. small diameter bomb or a JDAM? No, absolutely not. But they are relatively effective, and they are more accurate than what the Russians have been deploying. And we anticipate that will only increase, and the Russians will eventually get that piece of the puzzle more refined and more capable as the war continues. Again, the Russians are all in on this. They fully understand a defeat in the borderlands could have long-lasting implications for the Russian state. It is incredibly detrimental from the Russian perception, not the Ukrainian perception, the Russian perception, not a Western perception, a Russian perception. And you have to take into account the Russian perception, because that is what is going to drive the will of the enemy to continue to fight a war. And that's what we're seeing. Now, as we gravitate from what is happening in Ukraine, in the borderlands, we have to look at the ongoing war that is taking place in the Gaza Strip between Hamas and Israel. Israel has effectively encircled Gaza City. You can see here on the on our map that Gaza City is sealed off. And the Israelis are going to chip away at this in a very slow and methodical manner. Additionally, we may have seen the first battlefield use of a laser intercepting a ballistic missile. We believe a ballistic missile was fired from Yemen towards Israel. That missile either malfunctioned as it was trying to re-enter the atmosphere, or it was intercepted, quite possibly, by an Israeli laser system designed to shoot down ballistic missiles. We're still trying to ascertain what was used. Very difficult to do that, but it is possible. We know the Israelis have been developing, in conjunction with the United States, those systems. Now, we're seeing a bleed over of this conflict here in the United States. You can see here thousands of mostly peaceful radical left-wing protesters and Palestinians trying to storm the White House. But it's mostly peaceful. Storming the White House, in this case, is okay, as opposed to what we saw with the fanatical and aggressive prosecution of persons during January 6th. Storming the White House is okay. It's okay. You can do it. If you are a far left-wing protester, you are given that exemption. I believe one person was arrested as these Palestinians and left-wing radicals tried to attack the White House. Insanity. It'll probably get worse in Washington, D.C. There are essentially over 100,000 students in D.C. There are multiple schools in Washington, D.C. All of these schools are bastions of radical left-wing ideology that hates the United States. Hence, they bring in these shithead Muslims from Palestine that also hate the United States, but do not like their own countries, as they are despotic dictatorships. So they come here, they bask in freedom, and then they try to change our country, the United States, back into their despotic crap countries. And that's what they're doing. So that's where we set for today. We will continue to monitor and report. Thank you for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Have a good day.